All right, everybody. This video is replacing the in-person meeting we were going to have on Tuesday because only one of you showed up. So wasn't much point to doing that. So this is what I would have covered in that session. Okay, so this is covering, or what we're going to cover today, is Judith Jarvis Thomson's A Defense of Abortion. This is a pretty famous philosophy article, just like the Singer one that came before. It is, also like the Singer one that came before, one of the few philosophy articles that sort of makes a name for itself or becomes fairly widely known outside of philosophy. And in the case of Thomson's article, it's because of what she's talking about. Notice that when she's writing this, so it's published in autumn 1971, that practically speaking means she wrote it either in like 1970 or early in 1971 or something like that. When she's writing this, abortion isn't legal in the United States, which is where Thomson was at the time, I believe. She's a professor at MIT, and I think she was there back then too. So she's not writing to defend the morality of something that's already legal. She's arguing for the morality of something that is, broadly speaking, illegal in America at the time, in most places, not everywhere. Okay, so because abortion is such a hot button issue, I don't know where that term came from, hot button, what does that mean? Like, when is a button hot? I don't know. But because it is such a controversial issue and because it is such an issue that raises such emotional force in people, an article like this that deals with that issue in a rather provocative way was sort of bound to get a lot of attention. And you do find people outside of philosophy classes, outside of philosophical discussions, using some of the examples from this article. Now, part of the reason I say that her approach to this issue is provocative is that Thomson does an interesting thing, which is she avoids the standard debate about abortion. And what's been the standard debate about abortion for a while. The abortion debate back then in the early 1970s and the 1960s and all the way through till now tends to turn on one question. And that question is the fetus a person? Now I say, is the fetus a person rather than a question that often gets asked but is not quite on target, which is the fetus a human being? So you can sort of think of two questions here. And one of them is of moral importance, and one of them isn't, at least not immediately. Right? So the question, is the fetus a person, is asking a moral question. To be a person is to have certain rights. Right? To be a person means you have to be treated in certain ways. And to be a person means you are liable to be treated certain ways. Right? So people are, generally speaking, responsible for what they do, which means you can blame people for what they do. You can hold them responsible for their behaviors. But the flip side of that is we typically think that people, or persons, have a kind of moral standing that other things don't have. So just like we don't blame the bee for stinging us, or if you do, you're kind of stupid, right? I mean, holding a bee responsible for stinging you, like getting angry at the bee, might be your immediate reaction, but if you think about it, hopefully you'll come to the conclusion like, look, that's just what bees do. It's not like the bee didn't like me or made a decision to try to hurt me, right? The bee was just following a fairly simplistic program, fairly simplistic algorithm that's been coded into its brain, to the extent that bees have brains, by evolution. I actually don't know how the central nervous system of a bee works. Also, at the same time, you don't have to explain what you do to bees the same way you do to people, right? If a bee is annoying me and I kill it, there might be some extreme animal rights people who get upset, but most of us won't. Whereas if a person bothers me and so I kill them, everyone hopefully will get upset. Right? So to be a person is to have a certain moral status. Now, the question of whether the fetus is a human being doesn't immediately ask a moral question at all. To be a human being is just to be a member of a certain biologically specified species. Right? And that is not, immediately anyway, a moral matter. For it to be a moral matter, it would have to be true that all human beings are persons. And some people do think this. Some people think person and human being just mean the same thing. Right? But there's not really any reason to think that. There's not really any reason to think that all persons are human beings or all human beings are persons, right? Suppose somehow it were possible to keep someone alive, not just with brain death, but like complete brain removal. So you hook their body up to a complicated set of machines that keeps their heart beating, that injects hormones into their blood, to take the place of the thyroid, which I think is near the brain, or on the brain. But anyway, it's controlled by the brain. It can basically fulfill all the functions of a brain, but it's just a collection of machines. All the functions of a brain that are necessary to keep your body alive. Would that thing be a person anymore? I mean, I think most of us would say no, right? The person died. We're keeping their body alive. That's all. Now, in some cases, it can be difficult to tell because the person, like in real cases where people suffer brain death, there's often some question about like, well, are they really gone entirely? It's difficult to say. But if I like fully remove the brain and put it in a blender, right? And I know that's gross, but like, so there's no brain left, right? There's just the matter that used to be a brain. And I hook the person up or the human being up to machines, they're not a person anymore. Right? Similarly, it seems pretty clear that something can be a person without being a human being. Think of a lot of near human species. When Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what I guess we are, came out of Africa, sometime 100,000 years ago, I don't know precisely when, they found other near human species around, the Denisovans, the Neanderthals. There had also been lots of other near human species in Africa with them. And these things could use tools. I mean, they seemed just as sophisticated as Homo sapiens sapiens around that time. They could use tools. There's some evidence they used fire. They buried their dead in ritualized ways, which suggested that they thought there was an afterlife, right? Those things are persons, right? Like, I'm willing to accept, like, if we find in the woods somewhere in Russia, I mean, this is incredibly unlikely to happen. It's not like Russia hasn't been explored. But suppose it were the case that we came across some part of Russia that nobody had been to, some deep Siberian forest, and we found Neanderthals there. They'd be people. They'd be persons. They wouldn't be human beings, but they would be persons. They would have rights to be treated in certain ways. They wouldn't be as smart as the rest of us, or most of the rest of us. Of course, there are some pretty dumb people out there. But we don't, hopefully, only grant the title of human being or a person to sufficiently intelligent beings, right? So it's not obvious that human being and person mean, in fact, it's, I think, pretty clear. Human being and person don't mean the same thing. It's possible for there to be persons that aren't human beings. It also seems like it's possible for there to be human beings who aren't persons. And so the moral question that typically determines where you stand on the abortion issue is the one about a person, right? The idea is, most people think, if your answer to this question is yes, then you should be what we call in America pro-life. You should oppose abortion on moral grounds. And the thought is pretty straightforward and plausible. If it's a person, an abortion kills it. And you shouldn't kill people. That's one of the things that the moral standing of a person involves, is they have a right to be alive, so you can't just kill them. Whereas, right, if your answer is no, they're not persons, then it's ordinary to think they don't have any rights. They're not going to have rights until they're born, right? And at that point, then it's wrong to kill them. Before then, no. So this is typically how the debate goes, right? Some people try to make it about whether or not they're part of a given species. That is something biologists can answer, but biologists don't answer ethical questions all by themselves. It's not their job. What makes Thomson and this article so provocative is Thomson is arguing that this question doesn't matter. And the way she's going to argue for it is by saying, let's just assume yes. She's going to argue that that abortion is moral, even if the answer to this question is yes. She's going to adopt the position that most pro-life people have. Now, she isn't doing this entirely just for the sake of making an argument. She's partly doing it for that reason. But another reason, which she reveals in the article, is that she's of the position, which I think most people are, that the fetus isn't a person at some points of the pregnancy, but is a person at other points. She's not sure where, but she suggests that it's kind of absurd to think that a fetus, like a day before birth, isn't a person, but a baby that's just been delivered is. And she also thinks it's absurd to think that, you know, a few hours after conception, when it's just a clump of cells, that the fetus is a person. Right? And so because she thinks, well, at least part of the time of the pregnancy, the fetus is a person, and because she wants to establish her argument on the firmest ground possible, she's working under the assumption that yes. Further, right, she's answering the following question in a way also congenial to the pro-life side. And that question is, do all persons have a right to life? Now, one way to avoid the pro-life position, if you've answered that the fetus is a person, is to just say no to this. You might say, no, not everyone has a right to life. Not every person has a right to continue living. But that's not what Thomson is doing. Thomson's also going to answer that question with a yes. Now, some people have denied that all persons have a right to life. You from time to time hear people, especially people who want to sound tough on the internet, claim that criminals have lost their right to life, and that's why it's okay to kill them. That's the worst looking "why" ever written by a human being. Let's erase that, replace it. And of course, there are certain varieties of racists, right, who will say that, well, not all people have a right to life because there's different grades of people, blah, 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 blah. But for the most part, right, people aren't going to usually take the position that the fetus is a person, but it doesn't have a right to life. If you want to deny that the fetus has a right to life, the easier ground to do it on is to deny that it's a person. And so Thomson is not going to deny that. She's going to say the fetus is a person. She's doing that really for the sake of argument because she doesn't think that's always true, but for the sake of argument, she's saying it. And then she's going to say all persons have a right to life. Yes. So she has agreed in this article that the fetus has a right to life. You might think, well, like, doesn't that just settle the issue that abortion is wrong since abortion is intentionally ending the life of the fetus? And so violating that right? Her answer is no. Her answer is that just because the fetus has a right to life, that doesn't make it wrong to kill it. And you might think that sounds bizarre. And in a way it does, because we normally invoke rights to life to prove a slightly different thing, right? We normally talk about a right to life in order to prove something slightly different, which is a duty to not kill. And the thing is, and this is one of the things Thomson wants to argue for, is that that inference is not automatic. You can't argue immediately from a right to life to a duty not to kill. And the way she's going to do it is a combination of ways. One way is to point out, and this is, I think, one of the most important things about this article, that your duty isn't determined by the presence of a single right. Like if you identify a single right at play in some situation, that's not going to be enough to establish what your duty is, unless you also establish that there are no other rights involved. And part of what Thomson's going to point out is that even if, as she is admitted for the sake of arguments, right, the fetus has rights, the fetus isn't the only one who has rights. And so we're in a situation where rights are potentially in conflict with rights. The other thing she's going to do is to point out all the ways we standardly deny this inference from a right to life to a duty not to kill. And some of those are pretty straightforward, right? We don't think the right to life that the person attacking us in the middle of the night has means that we have a duty not to kill them. We think our self-defense rights override that, right? We tend, not all of us, but we tend to think that in especially a just war, it's okay to kill people who have a right to life. Right? We don't have a duty not to kill enemy soldiers. But it's not like just because they're enemy soldiers, they've lost their right to life. That's not standardly how, anyone thinks of it, because that leads to some pretty horrifying conclusions. To give you an example, standard ways of thinking about war say it's okay in the process of fighting a battle to kill people on the other side. But it's not okay after that battle is over to kill prisoners who have surrendered. The idea is they maintain their right to life the whole time. The enemy has a right to life the whole time. Once they're no longer actively trying to defeat you and kill you, that right to life means you can't kill them. That's why you can't just slaughter prisoners of war who've surrendered. Now, if they haven't surrendered, maybe you can kill them, but if they have surrendered, if they've given up their weapons and no longer a threat, standard way of thinking about war is you can't kill them. And the only way that makes sense is if they still have their right to life, which meant they had it, an hour ago when they were fighting you. But something about that situation meant that their right to life did not produce a duty not to kill. And so what Thomson's really doing in this article is not engaging with the ethical issue about the nature of personhood. That is an important ethical issue. Right? What is it about us that makes us morally special? Because pretty much everyone agrees, most people agree that human beings are morally on a different plane than other animals. Not everybody, but most people. Even more people will agree that human beings are on a higher plane than plants. I have met a couple people who didn't think that, who thought trees were just as valuable as human beings. Maybe trees aren't the best example because trees do a lot of work to help us out in a lot of ways, but a potted plant, right? I have trouble imagining what could lead a rational person to say that a potted plant has just as much value as a human being, but I bet them. But even those most extreme people will admit that human beings have a different moral status than rocks, right? You can do things to rocks you can't do to human beings. It is an interesting and important moral question. What gives us that status? That's the kind of question you have to deal with if you're going to take this question, the question of is the fetus a person, to be the important question in the abortion debate. She's avoiding that question. She's also avoiding the question about the basis of rights. That's actually very related to the issue of what makes you a person, because presumably whatever makes you a person is also going to explain why and when you have certain rights. But there are other issues involved in that. Right? So there are complicated questions when it comes to rights about how much your rights depend on certain social facts and how much they don't. So for example, how many of your rights and to what extent are your rights yours because of what the government says? To what extent are your rights yours because of what the society you live in says? Things like that. She's avoiding that question too. What she's pointing out is, even if you grant that there's a right to life, there's all sorts of ethical issues that you have to deal with. And probably the most important for her is that thinking that citing a right to life answers the question just really simplifies things too much. Right? That makes the ethical issue far more simple than like a mature person can honestly say it is. Right? If you're going to build your ethical theory around rights, which Thomson does, and just to point it out, and this is something I'll get to in a subsequent video, which Singer does not, right? You might have noticed that like rights don't play much of any role in Singer's argument, but for Thomson they do. If you're going to have your moral view based on rights, you have to survey the whole situation and all the rights in play because rights can conflict. Rights are sort of general things. You, generally speaking, have a right to life. You have it across a wide range of scenarios. Maybe all the scenarios you're ever in. Maybe it's impossible to lose your right to life. But what that means is sometimes your right to life is going to be unopposed by other people's rights, and sometimes it won't be. And so in the case where there are oppositions between rights, then there's complicated questions that ensue. Now, in the case of abortion, that's typically not what we're dealing with, because abortion isn't usually something that someone does in order to save their life. It can be. There are cases where that happens. And it's worth saying now that despite how provocative this article seems, Thomson is arguing against a fairly extreme view. And that extreme view is the view that abortion is always wrong, even in cases of sexual assault, even in cases where the mother's life is at risk. Nowadays, there's very few people who are, for example, calling for abortion to be illegal in such cases. There are people in that situation, but not many, right? So, for example, the Republican Party, which has, in the context of American history and the context of like Western societies, a very extreme position on abortion, and a fairly unpopular one. The Republican position on abortion does not poll well. So, like, they are not moderates on this issue. But the Republican Party does not call, not generally. They did a couple of years ago, but there's pretty good evidence that that was just like an oversight on their part. They don't typically call for making abortion illegal in cases of sexual assault of the mother or where the mother's life is at risk. Thomson is looking at a view that says abortion is wrong all the time. And you might think that that's a position that someone has to have, this extreme position that abortion is always wrong, no matter the situation. You might think that's a situation you're forced into once you say that the fetus has a right to life. Because after all, the fetus's right to life doesn't go away because of how the fetus was created. The fetus's right to life does not go away just because the mother's life is in danger. That's not how rights work, right? If you and I are on the Titanic or some boat that's sinking, and there's no room for both of us on the boat, right? Other people are on the boat. We're the last two to get there. We both have our right to life. It's not like one of our rights goes away just because the other person is in danger. It's not how rights work. And it's not like where you come from determines what rights you have, or how evil your daddy is determines what rights you have. If it turns out, if you find out later in life that your dad was a serial killer, that doesn't have anything to do with you. At least not your right to remain alive. So some people have thought, and some people with this extreme position that Thomson has talked about, have thought that if you answer yes to both these questions, is the fetus a person, do persons have a right to life, that you're forced into the extreme position that abortion is always wrong, even in cases where the mother has been sexually assaulted and that's what caused the pregnancy, and even in cases where the mother's life is at risk. All that she's officially doing, all that Thomson is officially doing in this article, is arguing against that extreme position. And the basis of that argument is that opposed to the right to life of the fetus is the right of the mother to, let's say, and this is not a term she uses, let's call it a right to bodily control. or integrity. The mother, just like all people, has a right to decide what happens with their body. We all do that, right? We all have that. If someone comes up to you and says, hey man, I need some blood, right? You got to give me some blood. You're like, no, I don't. I mean, it'd be nice if I did, but I don't have to because it's my blood. And yeah, there's a whole procedure involved in taking it. And I don't have to do that if I don't want to. Right? So there's the mother's right to bodily integrity versus the fetus's right to life. Ordinarily, people get to decide whether to have medical procedures done. Ordinarily, people have a right not to be have their lives ended, not to be killed. In the case of abortion, those rights come into conflict if, as Thomson is doing in this article, you're saying that the fetus is a person and has a right to life. So in order to help focus your thinking, and this is really the reason why this article is famous, in order to focus your thinking on this issue, Thomson wants to use really evocative examples. And the most evocative and the most famous is the violinist example. So what she asks you to imagine is, suppose somebody kidnaps you and you wake up the next day and there's a world famous violinist attached to your back. The violinist is suffering kidney failure. They need your kidneys to survive or something like that, some kind of organ failure. And the people who did this to you, big fans or friends of the violinist, say, don't worry, in 9 months we'll be able to detach him and he'll be right as rain. Here's what Thomson says. While it would be nice of you to put 9 months of your life aside to save this violinist's life, this violinist who is a person who clearly has a right to life, and let's say the violinist is completely innocent, they had no idea their friends were going to do his or her friends were going to do this, you have a right to disconnect the violinist. You have a right to say, nope, nobody asked me. Right? So the fact that this connection between you and the violinist is non-voluntary is supposed to be analogous to the situation that a woman is in when she's pregnant as a result of sexual assault. It actually won't just be that. In another part of the article, Thomson, after she introduces the violinist example, Thomson points out that there are a lot of cases where pregnancies are involuntary, beyond just cases where the woman was sexually assaulted, because of course you can take steps to prevent pregnancy that don't work. Right? That doesn't make the pregnancy voluntary. You took a risk, but taking a risk that something will happen does not make the thing you're risking voluntary. It doesn't mean you wanted that thing to happen. The very fact that you took precautions shows that you didn't want it to happen. And she has this neat little example about people spores and screens. I say neat even though I kind of hate that example. I think it's kind of silly. But the violinist example is a good one. There's an innocent person who depends upon you. And they are completely within your power. The only way they can survive is for you to give up full control of your body for 9 months. And the time is, Thomson thinks, important. What she says is, if the violinist only has to be connected to you for like an hour or a day, it would be ridiculous to suggest that you had the right to disconnect him, right? Or her. The significance of the amount of time and how debilitating it can be to have the violinist hooked up to you plays a role here. And what Thomson thinks is, in this case, your right to bodily control or integrity, in the case where you didn't voluntarily hook up to the violinist, means that the violinist's right to life is overridden. They don't lose their right to life. It's just that their right to life, given that it's in conflict with other rights, does not imply that you have a duty not to kill them. You get to kill the violinist, because after all, your intentionally disconnecting the violinist will kill the violinist. Let's say that's been explained to you, right? And you believe it, and it's true. And what Thomson says is, look, this is just basically the situation that obtains between a mother and the fetus that's growing in her. in cases where the fetus's presence is not voluntary. Now, because she's only arguing against the extreme view, she never has to go beyond this example and discuss what would be the case if the pregnancy were voluntary. She touches on that issue briefly, where she says that, well, if you intentionally get pregnant, then I believe she uses the term it's indecent to terminate the pregnancy afterwards, because then you voluntarily did something. And our voluntary actions, while they don't get rid of our rights, most people think. I mean, some people think that, but they can, in a sense, alienate our rights temporarily. Like, you can give up your right to something. Like, let's say you own a plot of land. You can, by voluntary action, give up that right, either permanently or temporarily. Right? That's something you have it in your power to do. And once you do that, you don't just get to go back on it anytime you want. Right? So for what you might think of as the normal case of abortion, where there's some element of voluntariness involved, where like precautions weren't taken or something like that, the point she's making, the argument she's making, gets a little bit tougher, but that's why she's focusing on the extreme case. Can you take these arguments and turn them into a general argument that abortion is always okay? Thomson seems not to think so. This defense of abortion is a limited defense. She does, of course, because she doesn't really think the answer to the first question is always yes, because she thinks it's sometimes no. In some cases, especially early on in the pregnancy, Thomson's, of course, going to say the fetus just doesn't have any rights. That's her real answer. But she wants to show in this article that rights to life don't immediately generate duties not to kill because of conflicts in rights. And this goes beyond the issue of abortion. This applies potentially to any right there is, right? If I have a right not to be physically assaulted, that doesn't necessarily generate a duty not to physically assault me. It will, you might think, most of the time, or in standard cases. But there will be cases where rights come into conflict with other rights. If I have a right to my property, that won't necessarily generate a duty not to steal, because rights can come into conflict with each other. And this is the really important ethical point. This is the really important point of moral theory here. Rights don't automatically generate corresponding duties. Whether or not they do is determined by the full set of morally relevant factors in any given case. If you pay really close attention to what Thomson says here, there's all sorts of things, all sorts of facts about a case that can impact it. So, for example, if a pregnancy is late enough term, Thomson pretty clearly thinks the mother doesn't have a right to terminate the pregnancy. Why? Because it's not going to take that long for the pregnancy to come to term. If it's a week from being, if the mother is a week from being able to have the pregnancy, the labor induced rather, it seems pretty clear Thomson thinks, no, right? You had the right to terminate the pregnancy before, but you just don't have it now. If, like I said, it was voluntarily and intentionally entered into the pregnancy, then Thomson's probably going to say, well, that does change things, right? All these facts matter. These facts about the history of the situation, the facts about what the near-term future is going to be like, right? There are also potentially, although this is kind of weird in the abortion case, you could also imagine a situation like this. It's not a violinist. It's a cancer researcher who's like this close to curing cancer, but their kidneys are starting to fail. And if you terminate their life, well, then the cancer cure is never going to get developed, and there'll be millions of people who die for no reason over the course of decades and hundreds of years. Then I'm pretty sure Thomson would say, no, you just don't get to disconnect the cancer researcher. Rights are often used in our way of talking about them as a kind of trump card, right? So if you've ever played spades, for example, there's a trump. Spades are a trump. It doesn't matter how high your card is in diamonds, spade trumps it. A two of spades beats a king of diamonds. Right? At least I think that's how it's been a while since I played spades. Rights are often used as that kind of trump, right? It doesn't matter how strong your case is, I have a right. And what Thomson is just pointing out is that's not actually the way rights work, right? It's not the case that your rights go away, right? You keep your rights when situations change. It's just that whether or not the right generates a duty, the normal duty we expect, depends upon facts about the situation. So the situation is much more complex than our ordinary way of talking about rights makes it seem, right? Because people do make claims all the time about rights that just seem like they're saying, because I have a right, that means I get to ignore everything else, right? Suppose that we go to war, right? Or I'll use a real case. Suppose it's World War II. And right now, the US government desperately needs to build a bunch of aircraft carriers, right, on the West Coast. And let's say you have a space of land, an area of land that would be perfect for building an aircraft carrier. And so the government comes in and says, look, we just need your land and we need the seashore that you control because we need to build aircraft carriers here. And if you say, I have a right to my property, it's not that you're wrong. You do have a right to your property. It's your property, right? You have property rights. It's just that the facts of the situation help determine whether that means there's a duty for people to allow you to control your property. And I think most of us would agree in that situation, the government gets to do eminent domain, which means they get to pay you what the land is worth and force you to sell, right? National security is at stake. The overall point that it's important to take away from Thomson is that point, the fact that a right to life does not generate a duty not to kill. A right to X does not necessarily generate a duty to promote X or protect X or whatever X is. The particular details, they're interesting, and you can talk about them in discussion. But that's the main thing I want you to take away from this. The next video is going to be about some of the contrasts between Thomson and Singer, because that's another thing. In addition to liking both these articles on their own, I really like the contrast in approach to ethical theory that they take. So that's what I'll be talking about in the next video.